Hi, this is Swapnil Bharti here. We are at Open Source Summit North America, and today we have with us Chris Aniszczyk from Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Can you please tell us a bit about yourself, Chris?
Sure. So my name is Chris Aniszczyk. I have a fun job of working at the Linux Foundation, which kind of consists of all these different open source foundations, right? So in particular, I was instrumental in the founding of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is also known as CNCF, and also the Open Container Initiative, also known as OCI. So, I serve as executive director for OCI and serve as kind of COO, CTO for CNCF. Before that, I spent a lot of time in the industry working on all sorts of open source things. I spent about 5 years at Twitter building out their open source strategy and infrastructure, running a team of developer advocates out there. Has been heavily involved with Eclipse technology. I wrote a lot of the original Eclipse tooling. I had an open source startup around Eclipse that did pretty well. I spent a couple of years at Red Hat. It was a lot of fun times there. So I've been heavily involved in open source for a long time, and now I have the fun job of actually like building out an open source foundation, which has always kind of been like a dream of mine to do.
So, what exactly does the CNCF do? If I'm not wrong, it was created when Google donated their Kubernetes project to the Linux Foundation.
So some of the kind of history of how that CNCF got started is, so Google was looking for a home for Kubernetes, right? They were hitting close to their 1.0 release, and they're like, we need to, in order for this project to be super successful, it needs a neutral home, right? Where people could trust that no one was going to steal the project or do it in a way where they wouldn't have influence on it. So the natural thing is to form an open source foundation. The cool and key to thing that I think Google did with a lot of the other founding, the 21 other founding members at that time was, this is going to be more than just about Kubernetes. Like really, if you look at it, this is a new form of computing. Like, I mentioned in my keynote this morning at the conference is certain internet scale companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, they've been running containers at scale for a long time. And really, this is what we mean when we talk about cloud native computing. And the goal was build a foundation around cloud native. Kubernetes happens to be an important piece of that, but there's many other important pieces to cloud native that are in spaces around logging, tracing, monitoring and storage and so on. And so CNCF would serve as that kind of neutral home and would help support and sustain these open source projects.
And if I'm not wrong, even Docker has donated some of their own technologies to CNCF. So now you have more than one project, right?
Yes. So when we started, we had one project. We had, Kubernetes when we started 2 years ago. Eventually, we added more. Prometheus was our second project, which is problem monitoring. And eventually, we got to a point where we brought in Containerd, which was basically spun out of, Docker Engine. It's kind of the core container runtime from Docker. And also Rocket, which was another kind of competing container runtime. And they both came into CNCF as projects. Which, funny enough, the joke was, 2 years ago, there was all this chatter about container wars and all this stuff. And, I think honestly, you don't hear that in the press anymore, since basically CNCF brought those projects in and OCI hit 1.0 recently. I think a lot of people realize the container industry is maturing. These projects are under neutral governance and an open source foundation. I just think it's a sign of maturity and, container wars are over.
At one point, CNCF or Kubernetes was seen as everybody but Amazon Club. But now even Amazon has joined the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Today, at the event, even Oracle has announced that they are joining the foundation. So what actually is going on in there with all these dynamics changing?
So this morning I mentioned we now have the top 6 public cloud providers in the world and in CNCF. And I think really what that is it just signifies that this early notion that we had that cloud native computing is really the future of how infrastructure is going to be written and done has attracted these big cloud providers to actually support these technologies and make sure they work well either on their clouds or they themselves are using technology from CNCF to power their public clouds. So I think this is just a sign that we structured the foundation in a good way to have these different companies involved, and we made the right technology choices to bring into CNCF. So to me, it's exciting because literally I've been in open source for a long time, and there has never been an open source foundation that has these top 6 public cloud providers working together under the same umbrella. Because in the market, of course they're competitive, right? They're businesses, they're corporations, but together they've come together in a foundation to really support and sustain this vision of cloud native computing, which to me is amazing. It's awesome.
What's really amazing is that CNCF is a big umbrella, but it's under a much bigger umbrella, which is the Linux Foundation. And you have CNCF,
Yes.
Cloud Foundry is there,
Node.js.
yes,
Yeah.
Node.js project is there, and then you also have the Linux kernel. So, what kind of cross-pollination is going on when all these projects and all these people come together under the same roof?
Yeah. So what's interesting is like, we tend to be fairly, I would say, isolated from each other in terms of like we have our own people that work on the respective, different foundations or sub projects, however you want to refer to them. But we do have kind of, face-to-face meetings occasionally across staff, or we have conferences like this week is Open Source Summit North America. And essentially most of our foundations within that Linux Foundation, we had a lot of board meetings here from different foundations. We kind of have this natural hallway, chatter that happens when you bump up into people. You're like, oh, I didn't know, like, EdgeX Foundry, like, cool, you're doing some cool stuff, in IoT, on the edge potentially, like, we're interested in Kubernetes. Oh, good, let's have a conversation. So you kind of have that natural pollination. It's not forced, but the Linux Foundation does, kind of help try to move these discussions along by having events, bringing people under the same roof so they could kind of learn from each other. But it's not like a forced integration or interaction. It kind of just happens, I think naturally. And to me, it's cool to be in an organization where of course you have Linus as a fellow, but you have all these cool foundations like Let's Encrypt. Like the fact that we have like this huge free SSL certificate authority that's under the LF is awesome in my opinion. And of course we have EdgeX for computing on the edge these days. IoT related efforts. Cloud Foundry doing cool things in Passland. So I'm just like, there's always cool stuff forming at the Linux Foundation, and so it's one of the most kind of unique places I think in the industry right now.
With OCI, you solve two big problems, and so what are the new challenges that are there in front of Kubernetes? Or if you look at from a different perspective, nowadays almost everybody is using Kubernetes in one capacity or the other. So what is the risk, that OpenStack project as one time, felt, it was getting bloated. So what are the risks there for Kubernetes?
So, my kind of thought process here is the fact that we have these basically top 6 cloud providers, in the world working together is something, OpenStack necessarily wasn't able to achieve, right? I think they've had great technology, but in terms of getting, kind of the cloud providers and other people on board, they weren't able to actually like crack that nut essentially, and so we were able to do that in CNCF, which I think is a huge advantage that we have. Of course, I think we may have issues that with great success, there's always a lot of growth, and how to manage that is a challenge. But so in CNCF recently, we've built out a team in China. We have a lot of growth of membership in China, so now we have a team on the ground there that's helping manage that. We're making some key hires in CNCF that will announce fairly soon, but we're adding staff to kind of help deal with the growth. In terms of projects, is the way we set up CNCF is that we have a very kind of independently elected technical steering committee that is full of really like technical luminaries and people who kind of compete that try to do the best thing for the foundation. And so they have a very high bar on which projects get into CNCF. But other cool, unique thing that they do is once a year, they're also going to review a set of projects and decide whether they actually still belong in CNCF or not. So it's kind of a natural way of you kind of think of them like spring cleaning. Like over time, the TOC make bets on certain projects, but over time it may not work out. And so like we may ask them like, hey, we don't want you potentially part of CNCF anymore because maybe the community is not growing enough, or it's something happens. So we kind of have this built-in process where I think we'll be self-correcting over time and not try to collect too many things and overextend ourselves. So I think that was one of the I don't want to say mistakes of OpenStack, but like lots of buzz, lots of great projects, lots of vendors involved. It was a little bit too much, and I don't think they had that natural filtering process built in. But I think they're working on it. They're narrowing in scope. So that's my opinion. But so I think we tried to learn from our different open source foundation friends. So
any new projects at CNCF?
So we have two new projects in CNCF. We've got our 11th and 12th project today. Oddly enough, both from ride-sharing companies. So, Lyft, originally created this technology called Envoy, which is basically a super performant, fancy reverse proxy. But a lot of people these days refer to them kind of as server mesh type technology, and that is being brought into CNCF and is being used by a lot of companies out there at scale, which is awesome, and is also potentially being integrated with different Kubernetes projects, Kubernetes-related projects like Istio and so on. So I'm happy to have Envoy as part of CNCF. The other project from the other ride-sharing company, Uber, ran into similar issues. Like both these companies were building out incredibly complex microservice-based architectures that needed to be scaling out. One issue that you have to deal with is tracing, right? Like if something goes wrong in a microservice, it causes this terrible problem of like, well, if something breaks, it's going to break a whole other set of, other services and so on. It kind of goes like this crazy, thing where you have to kind of go debug what's wrong. Jaeger from Uber is a distributed tracing solution that is based on the open tracing specification in CNCF that basically helps you debug what happens when things go wrong. Trace what's going on with your services, because generally if things go wrong, it tends to be like the worst like murder mystery ever, where like you're like, okay, this service is down, but why? It's like, well, because this thing went down. And you keep like going down this like terrible path until you actually find, what's actually wrong. So I'm like super thrilled to have these two folks part of the foundation and also participating on a project level.
What is the biggest thing that's going on with OCI?
So I mean, really the biggest thing about OCI is it's taken 2 years to get us to a point where we're able to ship 1.0. And to me, like I've talked to a lot of companies out there that it's silly, but until something hits 1.0, there's just this natural fear of adoption, or things may not be mature enough for for them to adopt. But now that 1.0 has happened, we're seeing a lot more interesting tools being built. Adoption is becoming stronger with an OCI. So I'm personally like that's the achievement. They were able to get all these companies together and decide on a minimal set of container standards, essentially, to ensure portability across different cloud providers and different container engines. So to me, that is like the huge notable achievement. In the future, we will expand into other areas. There's been some discussion around distributions, kind of a thorny subject in OCI. So like you have a multitude of different container registries out there. So there's different ways of fetching and pushing out containers. It would be great if there was maybe a standard set of API that could be used all across these different solutions. So that's something that we're looking into. Another interesting thing that people don't realize is there was once OCI hit 1.0, we had essentially a patent non-aggression clause in there. So I think on top of containers becoming mature and stable by having a 1.0 standard, all these companies that were part of OCI signed a basically patent non-aggression agreement. So now we kind of have even further notion of stability, because we're worried less that patents may be a thorny issue in container land because of us shipping 1.0. So to me, it's like good news all around in terms of containers becoming stable, mature, and maybe even over time they'll be boring in a way where like they just work. We rely on them. They're part of infrastructure, just like we depend on HTML standards. HTML files work across all the browsers, works extremely well. No one really talks about HTML files because they all work on using fancy JavaScript frameworks like React or Angular to write their stuff, but it's all reliant on these like standard definitions of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in order to work.
Now, and we discussed about it earlier also, that as these container technologies are kind of becoming standardized or kind of like HTML, where will the actual competition happen? Where will these companies compete?
The browser analogy is not perfect by any means, but I think it does demonstrate where people will compete. So not many people focus on actually the HTML specification or CSS. Like there's very little movement there. Like, there is some activity over time, but it's usually like, hey, one of the browser engines creates a cool feature, other browser engine copies it, and eventually may get pushed down to the specs. But where the browser's engines actually compete on is developer tooling, maybe performance, maybe security in some unique ways. And you're going to see the same effect in container land, right? The orchestration engines will compete on security features, developer tooling, speed of deployment, and all these things. So I think you'll kind of see that type of competition happening at like the developer tooling, performance, security level, similar just how browsers, like I love Chrome because the Chrome developer tools are amazing, but I would switch to Firefox if the developer tools got a little bit better.
Thanks, Chris, for talking to me today. It was a really interesting conversation. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Hopefully we'll see each other again at some future open source event, most probably the upcoming .conf.
Yeah.
So absolutely. Once again, thank you. Back to my audiences, thanks for watching. If you like this interview, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and see you again soon. Bye from now.